He has now said he will reduce the carbon tax, the consumer carbon tax, down to zero. What that means is he doesn't need to reconvene Parliament because he isn't eliminating it legislatively. He's just doing an order in council to reduce it down to zero. Okay. Number one, he said immediately. Number two, that piece of paper that he signed in front of cameras dramatically said April 1st. That's not immediately.
Yeah.
So there's already a little bit of a bump there. Now, to be fair, if it were completely gone, that's big savings. You're saving like $13 per minivan fill up, $20 per pickup truck fill up, and about $400 per household on your home heating bill. But again, he's promising to not axe the tax. He laughed about that in Kelowna in BC recently. He's changing it. And that's the big difference.
No group has followed the impact of government financial policy or tax policy, as it were, than the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. They do all the work, and that's why I've donated to them, by the way. I want to be upfront with that, because you need this information, whether it's on the tax system or whether it's on the whole increase in government debts and deficit, where they're spending money. All of that is just part of the milieu that we're operating and living in Canada. That's why I'm so pleased to welcome back to the show Kris Sims. She's, of course, Canadian Taxpayer Federation, happy in Alberta. She was in BC, but she escaped. That tells you how taxes do impact people. Kris, I know there was other reasons, but hey, you're doing better than the people out in BC are.
Yeah, we are. We were very fortunate to be able to be offered a position here with the Taxpayers Federation. So we hit the Crow's Nest Highway and we stopped in Lethbridge and bought a house here, which was amazing, which we thought was out of our reach as to a professional couple in their 40s. So yeah, very thankful to be here in Alberta. And thank you so much for supporting the Taxpayers Federation, because it's support from folks like you that help us actually do our jobs to hold government to account.
Let me come to one aspect that I wanted to chat with you about, and that is, obviously, I mean, there's a lot about the carbon tax, and there's a lot about, brouhaha. I mean, it's that thing is things that books should be written about, after whatever it is, 6-7 years of aggressively defending the carbon tax, telling me that more money was going to be in my pocket, if I have the carbon tax through rebates, and having people like the now Prime Minister Carney saying, if we eliminate the carbon tax, 2/3 of Canadians will be worse off. Other ministers said it was 80% of Canadians would be worse off. That about face, I've never seen the likes of that about face. And it was for political reasons. You can't claim, sorry, I'm going on and on, Kris, but you can't claim that it was about the climate, because you've still got Minister Guilbeault saying the most effective way of handling climate change is through the carbon tax. So that about face alone is going to be the stuff of textbooks, I hope.
In fact, it's funny you mentioned somebody should write a book. My colleague, Franco Terrazzano, the federal director of the Taxpayers Federation, just finished the book. Taxing the carbon tax, the rise and fall of the carbon tax in Canada. It's funny, I didn't even mention this to you before we got going. It's actually available for pre-order right now. It's not out yet, but it's on Amazon. I just finished voicing it for the audiobook, and I'm busy editing it right now. So I've read it out loud twice. And to your point, exactly, there's so much here. One, the very fact that the average hardworking Canadian has made the godfather of carbon taxes, Mark Carney, the guy who wrote a 507-page book praising carbon taxes to the stars. Everyday people made him yell uncle on the carbon tax and admit this is, at least politically, to your point, Mike, radioactive, and he's got to move away from it. So that itself is an achievement. So I will give that to the Canadian people. Now, of course, as you point out, the devil's in the details on this, and these details have, cloven hooves and big horns. So he has now said he will reduce the carbon tax, the consumer carbon tax, down to zero. What that means is he doesn't need to reconvene Parliament because he isn't eliminating it legislatively. He's just doing an order in council to reduce it down to zero. Okay. Number one, he said immediately. Number two, that piece of paper that he signed in front of cameras dramatically said April 1st. That's not immediately. Yeah. So there's already a little bit of a bump there. Now, to be fair, if it were completely gone, that's big savings. You're saving like $13 per minivan fill up, $20 per pickup truck fill up, and about $400 per household on your home heating bill. But again, he's promising to not axe the tax. He laughed about that in Kelowna in BC recently. He's changing it. And that's the big difference.
A couple of things for me there, though, that
Yeah.
they, again, I have trouble with, I seriously, I do not have problems when people have different political views or agendas or especially their priorities. I understand that. And I don't have, God didn't come and visit me in the night and give me the full wisdom. And you can't be, just seriously, you can't be in the investment markets. And first of all, not come away with some humility. And I've been 40 years in the investment markets. You also come away with a clear understanding very quickly of your own fallibility.
Yep.
So I don't sit there and go, oh, there's only one way to do this. So I respect that people have different views. My challenge is the vilification of opponents, and I'm including in the media. I'm waiting for my media apology, but the vilification of people who oppose the carbon tax, and all of a sudden, presto, because it's not politically convenient or saleable, because there's no climate reason. I mean, nothing changed in their rationale. I'll take their rationale at face value, what they thought it was doing. Nothing changed. Just their political fortunes changed. Sorry, I have a real problem with that.
I do too. And in fact, because we've been slugging this out, the Taxpayers Federation have been fighting carbon taxes since day one. Mm-hmm. And I've been in countless radio debates and TV debates with people. And I'll just get right into it, frankly. I have been called a monster. I have been told that I wanted Lytton to burn down, which is a horrendous thing to say to somebody else. These are by grown professionals. Yeah. These are not by online trolls or something. That's not what I'm talking about. And the most disgusting term I ever remember being called was a climate denier. Mm-hmm. Now, anyone who is old enough to have read a history book knows exactly what that word connotates. Yeah. That is a connotation to Holocaust denial. And to dare call someone a climate denier because they don't want Canadians hit with a carbon tax is disgusting. And frankly, anyone who used that term in a professional setting should be ashamed of themselves. And quick tip, bit of a comms tip for anybody who's in this field, don't let people call you that. If somebody calls you that, you go right back after them, because those are terrible connotations that should stay where they are. Second, it was just, 6 minutes ago, it seems. If folks might remember, now former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, remember when he jetted down to that Up With People conference in Brazil? Yeah. And he sat there with his sleeves rolled up, and he said out loud with his face that paying his carbon tax should take priority over paying your rent and feeding your kids. I'm not kidding. Yeah. And before that, journalists in Calgary were putting a mic in his face saying, what about this carbon tax? And he actually said, Mike, I don't know if you remember this clip. It was just a few months ago. He said, it's okay. The only people who are really paying the cost of the carbon tax are people with big mansions, an indoor swimming pool, and 3 big personal cars. Yeah. So what's changed? Yeah. That's what have changed. Yeah. Yep.
Sorry, but that's what I find incredible. Now, wait, I'm going to add one more thing, because I personally believe in accountability and responsibility. So it wouldn't irk me so much if some of those same people stood up and apologized. Yep. Or they absolutely equally viciously attacked the Liberals now, Mark Carney and Chrystia Freeland and everybody who was there. No apologies so far that I've seen. And that includes, and again, I don't want to get so far off track, but I've been watching the Green Party on this. Yep. Like in BC, people should keep in mind, in British Columbia, the Green Party props up the provincial NDP. This is the number one issue. And they said nothing when David Eby actually, a couple of months ago, said he was going to cancel it before really? Carney. Yeah. And then nothing when now officially they've said they're going to cancel it. I'm just, this has really caught a lot of people. I'd love to hear from some political historians if there's a similar kind of example of a party retreating for political purposes from the number one issue of the last several years. And again, we can go on and on about it, but I wanted to get to the industrial. Sure. Now, we're going to get something else here. And we haven't been given specifics, but Prime Minister Carney legitimately has referred to it. He hasn't given us all the specific, but we got a pretty good idea, because an industrial carbon tax, you can find them in other parts of the world. Not many parts, by the way, and not in Europe the way he said he was. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what's interesting here, and exactly to your point, Mike, and for your listeners who don't know, there is a federal backstop that's actually quite similar-ish to the consumer carbon tax. It's way more complicated. It involves credit purchasing and world markets and all that jazz. But there is kind of a federal mandatory minimum, as you would call it, for an industrial carbon tax. Now, certain provinces have opted to have their own versions of an industrial carbon tax, very similar to how the main carbon tax or the consumer carbon tax is currently applied in British Columbia. Now, British Columbia is technically tied to the parliamentary backstop, to the federal backstop, so you can't go below the certain amount. So it's 17 cents per liter of gasoline and 21 cents per liter of diesel. British Columbia's, though, is technically a provincial carbon tax. That's why your rebate scheme is different, okay? It's very similar, as of right now, as far as we understand, for the industrial carbon tax. What Carney is saying he's going to do, though, and this is where the rubber hits the road, is he's going to take the consumer carbon tax, because it gets upsetting for politicians when us uppity peasants notice how we're being screwed by the carbon tax, and he's going to put that into the industrial side. How much it's going to cost, we don't know yet, but it's going to be expensive, and here's why. Because Carney is now saying, he's taking a strange page out of Aaron O'Toole's playbook. He's saying that instead of the sometimes cash rebates that some Canadians do get sometimes, he's canceling those. And then he's going to force our industries, our manufacturers, our job creators, frankly, to pay into this sort of green points fund so that normal Canadians will eventually earn these green points with the government. Again, it's foggy. And they'll be able to pick government-approved items, like, I don't know, like a solar scooter or like an electric heat pump or something like that. This is the issue, is that you're going to have to be able to pick for some sort of government catalog type situation. You won't get the cash rebates back. And here's the kicker. Everybody pays industrial carbon taxes. So a fuel refinery getting nailed with this industrial carbon tax from the feds is going to pass that cost on down to you when you purchase fuels like gasoline, diesel, propane, natural gas. Same thing goes for utilities companies. If you run your heat or your power off of natural gas, which a lot of us do here in the prairies, you're still paying that. You just won't be able to see it. And lastly, and I can rant all day, sorry, Mike. This part is really key. This is what blew my mind. Why would we impose a huge industrial national carbon tax here in Canada when US President Donald Trump is ringing the dinner bell for America, saying, hey, industry, move to the United States, set up shop in Michigan, set up shop in Pennsylvania. It will chase those manufacturers, especially those that can leave in Ontario. It'll just chase them south. So it is a really bad idea.
And that last point, I think, is very key. We've had a period of 9.5 years, 10 years of declining capital investment, for example, declining foreign investment. There's a list of things, that the Bank of Canada summed up by saying that it's an emergency.
Yeah.
They never said that before. But listen to what Jack Mintz says. He's one of Canada's most respected economists, University of Calgary, public policy, that kind of stuff. But just summing up what you said as I was listening to it, Jack said, it's an administrative nightmare.
Yeah.
That's all we need, right? That's all we need. But but that comparative and competitive advantage seems to be absolutely, insane not to be paying attention to that. But that's how we got into some of the financial issues we've got today. We didn't prioritize being competitive economically, being competitive to attract capital, which is the foundation of economic growth. So, but the other thing, I look at this, I was upset with the thought that somehow consumers weren't going to pay anything, or it was have no impact on business or consumers. That's where I draw the line. Yeah. I think it's fine. If you prioritize climate policy over economic growth, that's legitimate. People can make a choice. But it's when you mislead the public. And to me, that was a big, fat one. When you say you can put in an industrial carbon tax and it will have basically no impact on business competitiveness or Canadian consumers.
This is why it is so critically important that Pierre Poilievre has come out and said, I'm going to get rid of all of them. Consumer carbon tax, industrial carbon tax. He's on the record saying he doesn't want the second carbon tax either. That's the fuel regulation tax that you guys pay there in BC. He's come out and said nuke it all from orbit, to borrow a phrase from the movie Aliens. Like, get rid of all of it, because you're right. We all ultimately pay for this. A business, an industry will not eat that increased cost. It can't. It can't continue to function. It won't work. So they pass all of the costs on down to us. And this is where things really get brutal for two reasons. One, because the carbon tax actually isn't an environmental solution. You're there in British Columbia, and you probably have seen the data yourself from the BC government. When we were first promised the carbon tax, and it first came in 2008, the government promised that it would be able to reduce emissions by 33% below 2007 levels by the year 2020. So again, 33% reduction by the year 2020. What happened? Emissions went up. So even in your heart of hearts, if you hug trees, I've done it myself, okay? I hand sewed my baby's cloth diapers. I grew up on Vancouver Island. This is not the environmental solution the government is telling you it is. It's not working. It's just making people poorer. And exactly to your point, Mike, it's those people that pay. The average working person will always pay the freight of this. And for a politician to stand there and say, magically, some magical Santa Claus of business will take away the cost of this and continue to do business and continue to employ people here, it's just not true. It reminds me, frankly, of the policy they had the other day when they said that 8 out of 10 Canadians are made more wealthy by a tax on everything. Like, no one with a shred of common sense believes that. You can't give the government a $20 bill and expect a 50 back at no cost to you. The government is not a wealth-generating machine. That's not how this works. And so this is why we're happy, frankly, that the carbon taxes are now front and center as an issue, and we're expecting the writ to drop here any second. I hope it stays this way, because you've nailed it, Mike. This is central to affordability, because it makes everything cost more. And if we can get rid of all of these carbon taxes, the prices of things will come down. It will help.
Let me just throw in one quick thing about British Columbia, because apparently, if I'm just extrapolating from what I read out of the Toronto press, they don't know it exists.
Right.
So for all the talk about carbon rebates, I just want to remind people the difference between the initial carbon tax, it was revenue neutral by legislation. The NDP changed that and said, no, I think that's a pretty good piece of the pie, I'll keep. Prime Minister Trudeau, at the very best, said, I'll keep 10% of it, let alone the inefficiency of not giving it back to small business for over 6 years. But keep in mind, in British Columbia, there was no rebate for anyone making over 60,000. So I'm reading all this analysis saying, oh, we get a rebate. No, they didn't.
No.
And that's what fueled the opposition. So if I'm in the environmental movement and I want to know, how did this get derailed? How did they get it passed in British Columbia, not passed nationally and not passed elsewhere? Well, look at the Alberta NDP, look at the BC NDP, who thought, hey, there's money to be made here. And look at the federal Liberals. They misunderstood the public, and they continue to misunderstand that the public is fed up and doesn't have the money any longer. So I had to get that in, because I haven't yet to see a single journalist out of our mainstream media recognize that BC did not have a rebate over $60,000. And so, anyway, sorry, it's obviously a problem for me.
It is a huge point. Okay, born and raised in BC, I was the BC director for a long time, and I remember covering the budgets and noticing that previous governments, I will also point out, were stuffing old tax credits into the revenue side.
That's what happened when Christy Clark came in.
Yes.
They started, again, off the top of my head, this part, what your point is right, but I think film tax credits all of a sudden showed up as part of the rebate. See, we gave that money back, and that's not what there was a group of Nobel Prize winners and Federal Reserve Chair and a huge group of Americans, off the top of my head, over 1,700 economists said in the States, they supported a carbon tax, but the key ingredient was government makes no money. Right. They said, if you want to get this thing through, government can't make any money. Well, they couldn't help themselves. Their commitment to getting money was greater than their commitment to fighting climate.
Yeah, and big time.
This is part of the...
The moment you give a bunch of politicians in the government a massive revenue stream like that, and we're talking billions of dollars per year. I had to dig to find it in the federal budget. They didn't even call it the carbon levy. It was like the climate change refund that will be returned to Canadians amount. Like, it was bizarre. It was around $12 billion. It was eye-watering amount of money that they were making off of this thing. And guess what? The emissions rates were going off the charts federally too. The Environment Commissioner, a nonpartisan watchdog, said, guys, we're missing these targets by a country mile. There's no way we're going to do it. And this is the key part. Two key elements to your points. One, a lot of those pointy-headed smart academics who said we support a carbon tax, they've got this carrot and stick mindset. If you hit people with a stick, meaning you make things like oil, gas, natural gas, propane too expensive, people will use less of it. The problem there is that for the vast majority of people, some people do live in a yurt and do things differently, but for the vast majority of the average working people, there is no alternative, affordable, abundant energy source for them to switch to. Mm-hmm. It's not like you're standing there at the grocery lineup and you've got a choice between paper and plastic bags. For the average working family, they're stuck using natural gas to heat their home. They're stuck filling up their vehicle to commute from Langley or from Abbotsford into their work. They're stuck with farmers who are using equipment that use oil and gas so they can all eat food. So this is it is an inelastic demand. So that is where they really stepped in it and they miscalculated this. This wasn't something they could just shoo people away from because they had nowhere to go by and large. And second, again, they didn't get the understanding of what was going to happen with inflation. So all of a sudden, inflation went crazy during the lockdown and people couldn't afford anything. And I know, Mike, you watch this stat too, and it's upsetting, and I'll try to stay calm, but it upsets me because I get phone calls from real people. 50%, half of Canadians now report to MNP that they're within $200 every month of not being able to make the minimum payments on their bills. That means keeping the credit card from phoning you. That means keeping the lights on and paying rent. That's what minimum payments mean. Half of Canadians are within $200 every month now. And I know there in BC, it's really tough. Here in Alberta, it's easier. It's around 40%. I think you're at about 53.
Yeah, 53.
That's rough. That is scraping by. That is living paycheck to paycheck. That is going into lines of credit to pay for bills. People need to understand this for affordability. And how dare politicians with expense accounts and taxpayer-funded salaries. The Prime Minister of Canada is paid $400,000 a year. How on earth could the Prime Minister understand truly what it is to have to scrape by to make rent and feed your kids? So this is why, again, it's so important that the carbon tax is an issue during this election, because affordability is the issue.
Well, you'll enjoy my shocking stat, by the way, but much more to come. Kris, thank you so much for taking the time. And go to taxpayer.com. Kris is the Alberta Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. They do great work. Thank you, Kris.
Means a lot to us. Thank you, Mike.